Lust is a man's problem, right? Wrong. When we see lust as an exclusively male issue, it leaves Christian women with nowhere to turn when they struggle with the same things. A 2016 Barna study found that 20% of Christian women use porn regularly, and those are only the ones that were reported it. These women suffer silently and often feel alone with nowhere to turn. There are numerous resources for men who struggle, but not women. So today's guest made it her mission to break the silence, banish the shame, and bring women's struggles into the light of God's grace and forgiveness. Today, we are going to be talking about how Christian women can overcome porn addiction and sexual shame. Welcome back to your Hope-Filled Perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in their God-given identity. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and I'm so honored when you choose to spend a few minutes of your week with us. Today, we are going to be having a really important conversation about how Christian women can overcome porn addiction and sexual shame. John 10:10 says, "The thief comes only to steal and to kill and to destroy, but I have come that they might have life and have it abundantly." The enemy is constantly after our minds and our hearts, but Jesus came so that we could have victory. My guest today is Jessica Harris, who is a writer and international speaker who talks openly and honestly about pornography addiction among Christian women in order to facilitate healing. She is recognized as a leading voice on the topic of female porn use and addiction in the church, and she is the author of the book Quenched, Discovering God's Abundant Grace for Women Struggling with Pornography and Sexual Shame. Welcome to the program, Jessica.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad that you're here and that we're having this conversation today, because I think people really do think that porn addiction is just a men's issue. Yet I know from working with so many women that that's just not the case. Now, what I also know, having interviewed hundreds of people, is that so often our ministry comes out of our own hurts, trials, experiences. Please share your story about addiction and what led you to writing Quenched.
Yeah, so I was exposed to pornography when I was 13 years old, and this was back in the day of dial-up and floppy disks. It was back in the late 1990s, and the internet was still kind of a new thing at that point. And so I think no one really understood perhaps the dangers of pornography on the internet. It was still kind of like in the back room of video rental stores, and people didn't really have an understanding of pornography online and the dangers of that. And so I was 13 and researching for school and just came across a video nestled in other kid-friendly educational type videos. There was a video of hardcore pornography. So I clicked that video just because I was clicking through mindlessly, as one does, just clicking through different things, and end up seeing this video of hardcore pornography. It starts throwing pop-ups like they tend to do, just pop-up after pop-up after pop-up. And next thing I know, I'm on a porn website. No matter how many times I tried to click out of the windows, I ended up on a pornography website. And I had been raised in the church, and so the only exposure or knowledge that I had of sex was that it was something that we didn't talk about, and it was something that you didn't do. So this exposure to pornography was in some ways fascinating, but also traumatizing at the same time. It was very violent content that I had been exposed to. And so it was like, this is what people are talking about. And I started to see it as a healthy outlet for my sexual curiosity. I wasn't actually sleeping with anybody. I was still going to be a virgin when I got married. I wasn't going to get any STDs. I wasn't going to get pregnant. Like, it felt safe. And I watched pornography for years. And my senior year of high school, I felt like, this has gotten a little bit out of control. I was reading erotica on school computers. Like at school, I was reading in the library on the school computers, reading erotica, and no one is going to question that. I'm a 4.0 student, a straight A student, top of my class. I look like I'm studying.
Right.
Nobody has any idea that I'm reading inappropriate content. I would get home from school and immediately go into my mom's room where our computer was and just watch pornography for hours until she was coming home. And then I would clear my history and type in some websites that looked like I was working on schoolwork so that she would think that that's what I had been doing all afternoon. And then after she would go to bed, I would like sneak out and try to watch the adult content channels on cable. We didn't get them, but back then, sometimes scenes would still slip through, even on channels that you didn't get. And so I would sit up just like waiting for scenes to slip through. And it started to affect my sleep. It started to affect my grades. Like school wasn't coming as easily as it had before. And I thought, okay, I need to calm this down a little bit. I need to get this under control. It's a little wild. And I found that I couldn't. I found that I was almost helpless to try to stop it in a way. And so I resorted to self-harm as a way to try to like get myself to stop. And I went looking for help as a senior in high school, 17 years old, and there was nothing. There was nothing out there for women who struggled with pornography. And it made me think, oh, am I the only woman in the world who's managed
Right.
to do this? Like, what's wrong with me? I couldn't find content for that. So then I went off to college and thought, okay, if I get caught in college, they'll be able to help me because they've surely seen this before. I was going to a Christian college. I got caught and they looked at me and said, we know this wasn't you. Women don't have this problem. And it was completely devastating for me because I thought, then what's wrong with me? Because I am a woman and I do have this problem. But now I really feel alone because if the dean staff at a liberal arts Christian college is saying that I'm the only woman in the world who's done this, and I do feel like the only woman in the world who's done this. And there was just so much shame in that conversation, and it was completely debilitating. And it made me just feel like I'm never getting out of this. I'm never going to be able to break free from this. There is no hope. There is no way out. And so I actually started to consider and pursue a career, I guess, in the adult film industry, because I thought, well, if I can't be the good Christian girl who used to be addicted to porn, then I'm just going to have to be the porn star who used to be a Christian. Like one of the two of these has to win out. I can't just keep balancing the two. So I dropped out of college and went home and tried to like figure out how to get into porn. And thankfully it's not that easy. It is now, but back then it wasn't. And struggled for a year just trying to figure out what am I going to do? Like I don't really want to do this, but it feels like I'm stuck and I don't really feel like
Mhm.
I have another choice.
Yeah.
And then God just worked in my life and worked on my heart, and I ended up at Bible college the next fall because that's where all aspiring porn stars go. And and it was there that somebody said to a room full of Christian women, we know some of you struggle with pornography and we want to help you. And that conversation changed it for me. Like that was my beginning of freedom. That was me going, okay, I'm not alone and there's a way out of this. And so I saw the power in changing that conversation from women don't struggle with this to we know some of you do. And that we know some of you do, that conversation is what gives women hope and gives women a chance to find freedom and pursue freedom. So I found freedom. I went through a program there at college, and probably about 2 years of really intense work, finally felt like I was free and thought, okay, surely by now somebody is talking about women struggling with pornography. I go online to look and there's nothing. And I felt like God was saying, okay, it's your turn to like share your story. And I was absolutely not. Under no circumstances am I sharing my story ever. And I want to bury this and keep it so far away that no one ever knows. And he just worked on my heart and showed me that women do need this. So I started my blog in 2009. So I've been doing this for almost 14 years and have met hundreds of women who needed to know that they weren't alone and needed to know that there was a way out and there was hope.
And that is probably just the tip of the iceberg,
Yeah.
because
Yes.
I would imagine most women feel just like you do
Mm,
without many resources out there. Now we have your book, but there's still not a lot of resources out there. And I would imagine most women still think, what is wrong with me? Because I don't know anybody else who struggles.
yeah.
What do you want to tell people who say this is not a female problem, or what kind of woman struggles with pornography? And talk a little bit about why we shouldn't emphasize the statistics regarding this issue.
Right. So the statistics, so we'll start with the statistics because I used to be a math teacher. So like I have zero problem with statistics and numbers in general, but we tend to um, not understand them or use them well. Like we play the lottery. I mean, that should be like indicator enough that we don't understand when the odds are like stacked against us. And people will look at statistics. So they might look at the one that you read in the intro of like 20% of Christian women struggle with this. Well, that's not that many. And they'll start to kind of excuse it, right? Oh, it's not. That's 2 out of 10. But then, like, let's define Christian and what does that mean? And maybe they're not. And so we just start to manipulate them to fit the narrative that we want to believe.
Yeah.
Um, as opposed to looking at the 10 women that we know around us and going, wow, statistically, 2 of these women at least struggle with pornography. We don't do that. We manipulate the circumstances so that we can stay comfortable in whatever we want to believe is true. But and when it comes to the statistics of women and pornography, we have to understand that there's like a generational difference too. With the advent of the internet came accessibility for women. If you look at the roles of women throughout the generations, they went from homemakers to being like active in the workforce and being able to go out and buy their own things, and being exposed to this sort of stuff. And so while men have kind of had the corner market, so to speak, for decades, it's a newer problem for women. Not to say that there aren't like 60-year-old women who reach out to me to say that this is a problem for them, but you'll see that the number increases as you get younger. So as you work through millennials, you might find 50% of them struggle with pornography. As you get down into Gen Z, you might find more like 75% to 100. But when you combine those statistics with the ones of like my grandmother, where virtually none of them struggle with this, then you almost water down the severity of it. And so it doesn't look like that big of a deal, but it is a big deal. There was a church who reached out to me and said, we did an anonymous survey of our 9th and 10th grade girls, and 100% of them struggle with pornography. And we were not prepared for this at all. So I think like we have to kind of take statistics with a bit of a grain of salt because we don't necessarily understand them or know how to apply them well. But for those people who say like this isn't a problem for Christian women, why not? Like, why wouldn't it be a problem for Christian women? Like the idea that it's almost okay and acceptable among men, but absolutely like there's no way that women do this is it's just a flawed train of logic. And it drives me nuts. But to have I've had pastors sit down and go, well, why would a woman do this? And I always counter with, why does a man do it? Like, we do it because we have sexual desires. Women have sexual desires, and pornography, even more so now than when I was exposed to it, is intentionally trying to speak to those desires. It's a business. And so it's going to find its untapped customer base and try to reach out to them and bring them into this. And so pornography is equally as accessible to women as it is to men. So why wouldn't women also struggle with it? And I think part of it just comes from the narrative that we've had over the decades to talk to men about it. We've said, oh, well, men struggle with this because they're visually wired. Men struggle with this because it's geared toward them. And we have these reasons why it's okay, so to speak, that men struggle with it. And when we've done that, we have made it a men's problem when it's always and ever been an issue of our sexual desires being preyed upon and manipulated and taken advantage of. And both men and women have those desires. It's not something exclusive to men.
As you talk to women who admit that they struggle with a porn addiction and sexual shame, what are some of the core themes that you've heard behind their struggle?
Mm. It's definitely a feeling of loneliness. It's just baffling to me that I've been doing this for 14 years almost, and still women will come up. I thought I was the only one. And at the same time, I spoke at a conference once, and a 12-year-old girl went up to her friend's mom and was like, "Why is she even talking? Like, all of my friends watch porn. What's the big deal?" So I think in older generations, perhaps there's this feeling of being alone. And in younger generations, there's this feeling of like not realizing what they were getting themselves into. With younger women, there's almost everybody's doing this, so there's not a big deal with it. And then they start feeling this pressure to kind of go further and exploit even themselves. Like we see this epidemic in sexting, or going and meeting complete strangers that they've met online and being taken advantage of in that way. So there's almost this innocence in younger generations of like not understanding the dangers of what they're walking into. And then in the older generations, you have this. I feel so alone in my struggle. Like I can't believe I'm the only woman who's done this. Whereas younger women, it's like everyone's doing this. So I don't realize how dangerous and scary this can be, and how this can affect me long term. I spoke at a teen conference once, and a young woman came up to me at the end, and she had written her story out in a little piece of paper, and she talked about how, and this is a high school conference, so she's in high school, and it's a Christian high school conference, so she's in a Christian high school, but she wrote out how she had sent nude images to her boyfriend and thought that that would make him love her, because that's what they're being told, that's that you've got to kind of earn it by giving it out. And he broke up with her, and then he sent those images to his best friends, and so now there's these boys in this Christian high school who have nude photographs of her when she wasn't intending to be like distributed to the class. She was trying to do this to earn the affections of her boyfriend. And I flipped the paper over, and she just written across the back, "I feel so lost. Like I don't know where to go from here. I don't know how to recover and heal from this." So I think there's not really a backdrop. People are always looking like, is it fatherless homes? Is it broken homes? Is it women who were abused? And there's no common theme like that. But on the other end of it, you have common themes of women feeling alone and feeling lost and feeling hopeless and confused about this struggle and where it's taken them.
If you could sum it up, what do you think is at the root of porn addiction and sexual shame?
I think it is a search for comfort, and a sense of almost of belonging, and um, maybe even safety, as odd as that sounds, because like no one would look at pornography and go, well, that is safe. But when we don't have the proper coping mechanisms, and when we don't have the proper strategies for dealing with things like stress, or for dealing with things like pressure, and for even how to navigate relationships healthily, when we don't have that proper framework, we look for it and for that guidance somewhere else. And so I think a lot of people will turn to pornography for a sense of comfort almost, and belonging, and at the same time a sense of kind of being lost to it. When you consume pornography, you can kind of just disappear to the world for hours at a time, and you come out kind of feeling better maybe, but also feeling worse about yourself. And that feeling of shame, like, wow, there's something wrong with me. Like I can't even function in a normal society here. Like I'm needing this, or I'm always escaping to this, or look at the content that I'm watching. This is stuff I would never actually do in real life. Or is it stuff that I would do in real life? It just leads to so much confusion. And when there's not a safe place to have a dialogue about that and to talk that through, you end up trying to talk it through on your own, and like you're not your best counselor. And so so you end up just driving yourself deeper and deeper into that pit of shame of, wow, there must really be something wrong with me for watching this kind of content, or wow, I can't believe I just spent 5 hours watching pornography, like I am wasting my life. And then when you're dealing with Christian women, they look at the narrative they've been given around sexuality and purity, and they say, man, I am screwing up the rest of my life. Like I'm messing up my marriage, I'm messing up my kids, I'm never going to be able to get married. We just, it's so intense and so personal and so intimate that it just affects all areas of your life. And that's where that level of shame comes from too, because it's just such a core issue. It's just such a core, pornography is such a core struggle. It's a struggle of identity, it's a struggle of intimacy, it's a struggle of relationship. And so the shame just sinks down into the core of who you are, and you have to try to pull yourself out of that. It feels impossible, absolutely impossible.
Isn't that just how the enemy of our soul works, though? At the beginning of this episode, I read John 10:10, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. And his MO since the Garden of Eden has been to tempt us to do something dishonoring to ourselves and to God. And then when we do fall for it, then he shames us for it. So
Yes.
it's like a two punch. He's the one who provides the temptation and lures us in, and then comes back and shames us and gives us the message, you'll never be lovable, God can't forgive you, on and on and on. I would be curious, from your perspective, what messages are women receiving, and what do they really need to hear?
Yeah, so receiving from pornography is that, I think pornography just, it tries to teach us what is acceptable in an intimate relationship, and so much of pornography is violent towards women. There is more content being developed now that's like designed to be more appealing to women, so it tends to be like more romantic. But on a whole, studies have shown that pornography is violent towards women. So we're teaching women, or pornography is teaching women to kind of lose their license. Like they're not allowed to have boundaries. They're not allowed to not like something. Like pornography is telling them what they should and should not like. Pornography is telling them that their worth and their value and their identity is all about sex and their appeal in that department. One of the things that's part of my story is I sent nude images to somebody when I was 17, and there is something that happens in that moment and I sent them to a stranger. So I didn't know this guy at all. And I realized that I had just given him some of the most intimate parts of who I am, and he didn't know me. And so pornography, it teaches us to separate our sexuality and like an intimacy. Like it divorces those two and says, oh, I can absolutely use you for sex, or I should absolutely be okay with being used for sex without him knowing my name, without him knowing my favorite colors, without him knowing, what my favorite food is or what scares me at night. Like we have lost all the intimacy that comes with sex. And I think that women need to hear that sex is meant to be this connecting and beautiful thing, and pornography is not that. It is not that. And our identity and our worth is not based on our bodies, and it's not based on our sexuality and what we do or do not do in the bedroom, and what we are or are not willing to do with someone in bed, but that we have worth and value that goes so far beyond that. We are image bearers of God. Like we are loved by Christ. And I share this in the book, that there's this argument about casual sex. Well, and pornography promotes that idea of casual sex. Like I'll just sleep with you, I'll get my satisfaction, and then I'll lose your number. Like it doesn't matter. But we are loved and bought with a price, and the intimacy of the sex act is used to illustrate in the Bible God's love for us and how he intimately loves us. And so when we water that down and kind of divorce sex from who we are as people and just make it about two bodies getting together in bed, we've lost all of the power and the beauty that it was meant to be. And so I think women need to hear that, like, not a message of shame of like, oh, pornography is so dirty and you're a horrible woman for doing this, but like, let's reframe the conversation about sex and talk about like how good and beautiful and godly it's meant to be, and how much you're meant to be loved and cherished in that act, not abused and taken advantage of, but tenderly loved and cherished in that act, and change that conversation so that women feel their worth and their value is not tied to sex at all.
That is such a powerful testimony, because I know that we have women listening right now who are thinking, I've messed up so bad, and I don't know how to get back to who I was before. And yet God still sees you as the beautiful daughter of Christ that you are. So, Jessica, would you explain for us what the 3 signposts of shame are, and why is it important for us to recognize those?
The 3 signposts of shame come from the book The Cry of the Soul by Dan Allender and Tremper Longman. And they take this whole book to address the emotion of shame and the role it can play in our lives, but really the way that it kind of separates us from a relationship with God and really healthy relationship with others. And so the first signposts that they have are kind of like the warning sign that there is shame in your life, or like the identifying symptoms of shame is an absorption with self. And so we think about how much shame is targeted at me, like at who I am so stupid. I can't believe I've done this. What have I, like, we become obsessed with ourselves, and it's all about our failures, the ways we've messed up, how no one could ever love us. In the context of Christian women who struggle, it might, there's no way God could love me. I'm worthless. I'm not worthy of that love. I'm a hypocrite. Even though God stands there with a love that he says is available to us, and he is telling us that he can give us, we're going, but I can't have that. Right. So that's the first one, is this absorption with self. And the second one, the second signpost, is a flight from exposure. So it's that tendency to isolate and to hide. We don't want to be known. And so we think back to even the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, when they take the fruit that they're not supposed to take. What is their action? They hide. They run from God. And so how often do Christian women who struggle with this, I'm not worthy, I'm so horrible, and now I'm going to push away from people, I'm going to hide, and I'm going to try even more not to get caught. And so that's something that I see a lot. Even though this thing that I'm holding on to so much is the source of my shame and why I'm feeling so ashamed, I need to protect it and make sure no one ever knows about it. And then the third signpost is violence, which it doesn't mean like you're going out and beating people up, but it is that lashing out and that protecting of that thing that we're trying to hide. And so I am such a horrible person for having this thing, and now I'm going to hide this thing. And then if you get anywhere close to me, I'm going to lash out at you. I'm going to be defensive so that you don't find this. And we also can turn violent toward ourselves. And so I mentioned that earlier when I shared my story, that I resorted to self-harm at one point, just trying to get myself to knock it off. So those are the 3 signposts. And the reason that you want to know that is because you want to be able to recognize, oh, this is shame that's causing me to do this. This is shame that's causing me to say this about myself. This is shame that's causing me to believe this about other people. This is shame that's causing me to isolate myself. I don't want to go out on a girls' night and then I'm going to sit at home and cry about how no one wants to hang out with me, even though I'm the one who made this choice based on shame. So being able to identify where shame is starting to still kill and destroy in our lives is helpful.
how do we separate the idea that shame comes from the enemy, yet we have a holy God who also sees us?
Mm. So I think the important thing is shame always isolates, always. It drives you into hiding, it drives you into isolation. Whereas God, who is holy and has always been holy, has always made a way to welcome us into relationship with him, even in that holiness. So even if you look back like into Israel and the temple and the tabernacle, there was a holy of holies, and there were like degrees of areas within the tabernacle, but there was a way for you to get from, there was a method. I am providing this for you. There's sacrifices and there's cleansing ways to get from the outer court into the not the holy of holies, because that was for the priest, but into the temple and into fellowship with God. So even though he's holy and he does have issue with sin, and does want us to live lives that honor and glorify him, his reaction to our sin is never one of, you are completely cut off, get out of here and never come back, I never want to see your face again. It is always, here is the way to come back to me. And shame does not do that. Shame says you better run, and you better just keep running because there's no home for you here. Whereas God is always, like, the whole story of the gospel and that whole arc of creation, and his desire has always been to make a way to
Yes.
bridge that gap with us. And so if whatever you're feeling isn't, the way to get to God, but instead the way to keep running, then what you are feeling is shame, not God and his conviction and his goodness and his holiness chasing after you. It's something else that's chasing after you.
So it's really the enemy, through shame, tries to keep this a secret,
Yes.
tries to keep us trapped in the mindset that I'm the only one and nobody else struggles with this and nobody will understand, or I will be excommunicated from the church, or on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
But God offers confession and repentance as a way to break through that, bring our situation, whatever our area of struggle is, into his light, and offers a way back to him.
Right.
Wow, what a good God.
Yeah.
What a good God. You use a story in the Bible that most Christians grew up with in John 4 to illustrate how we are looking for acceptance and intimacy and unconditional love. Why do you think this story resonates with all of us, and why this particular struggle?
I This story really spoke to me when I was thinking about it several years ago now, but I was thinking, there's a lot of stories in the gospel, but when you look at the gospels and Jesus' interaction with women, almost all of his recorded interactions with women are women who struggled with something sexual. Like almost all of them. The woman caught in adultery, the woman who anoints his feet, who has a history and a story in the town, and the person thinks, well, if he really knew who was touching him right now, he wouldn't let her touch him. um and then even the woman, she doesn't have a sexual past, but the woman with the issue of blood would be considered ceremonially unclean. And so when you see Jesus interacting with women in the gospels, it's women who have struggles that would normally like keep them out of the church and away from the religious people. And as I was thinking of that, I thought, I've never heard it presented like that in all of the years that I've been in church. And I have never once heard a sermon about God's grace for women who struggle with sexual sin. And yet here it is several times in the gospel of Jesus being known for having dinner with tax collectors and prostitutes, but we just like whip right over that and just keep going on to something else. And so I sat and I thought about this story of John 4, and we so often, it's just Jesus is a living water and everyone's happy and like, yay, we all get living water. And then I realized, like, no, this is a woman who's walking in shame. Like, let's look at this from her perspective. And when I did that, it just carried so much power for me as a woman who had that as part of my story, who had the sexual shame as part of my own story. And like, how does Jesus want to interact with that? And goodness, if John 4 isn't an answer for that, like, this is how Jesus wants to interact with that. This is how he did interact with that. And so I can't, I think when we struggle with sexual shame as women, we kind of go, well, this is what God thinks of me. And we project our thoughts of ourselves onto God and assume that he thinks about us the same way we think about us. But then when you're looking at it in the Gospels, you go, I'm wrong. I'm wrong. Like, this is how God thinks about me. This is how he wants to interact with me. And I think there's just such a power in confronting the lies of shame with that truth of like, you can't tell me God thinks about me this way, because here's how he says he thinks about me. Here's how he has shown that he would interact with me if I were walking the earth with Jesus right now. So I think there's power in that truth, and being able to look at shame kind of and say, you're a liar and you're wrong about me, and this is what God says. And there's freedom and hope and life that comes from tearing down those lies and replacing it with truth.
So for the woman who may not be super familiar with that story, what would you say the heart of Jesus's message is to her, that woman who is in that place struggling with sexual sin and shame as a result?
I would say that the heart is that he knows what you're struggling with, and he still offers himself. So in the story of John 4, this woman comes to the well, and I interpret the conversation back and forth as one of shame and defensiveness. You know, she's kind of telling Jesus to stand down, like he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's breaking cultural barriers by even talking to her or anything like that. And she's trying to shut it down. You know, she's trying to let me get my water and let me go home, please. And he kind of retorts back to her, like, if you knew who you were talking to, you'd ask me to give you water. And so then it's like this little match of wits. And she kind of says, like, who do you think you are? Like, how are you going to get water? And then he offers the living water. And as this conversation is going, the thing that I kept thinking was, I wonder if she's thinking, if you really knew who I was, you wouldn't be talking to me right now. And I think sometimes when Christian women are in the midst of this struggle, they think, God, if you really knew,
Right,
like, what I was going through, you wouldn't want anything to do with me right now. And I'll have Christian women say to me, like, I can't open my Bible because God's going to think I'm a hypocrite. There's no point in praying because he's just going to tell me what I already know I should be doing. Like, there's no point in trying to relate to God because he wants nothing to do with me. And here in this story of John 4, in spite of all of her defensiveness and in spite of all of her like dancing around the questions, Jesus still offers himself.
yeah,
And he reveals further on that he knows exactly who she's been the whole time, and he still offered himself. And then her next move is to ask about worship. And that always blew my mind, because it's like, this is a religious woman stuck in sexual sin. Like, this isn't just any old woman. Like, this is someone who is like, her first question is worship. And Jesus's response isn't worship. Like, let's back up here and talk about the whole husband thing. Like, he answers her. He goes ahead and he interacts with this question of worship. He doesn't shame her for, you know, if you really believed in worship, you wouldn't be living like this. He doesn't do any of that. He goes ahead and he answers her. And then she says, you know, when Messiah comes, he's going to set everything straight. And I just thought, this is a woman who in her heart of hearts is looking for Messiah to come and set everything right. And that's when he says, I am Messiah. Like, I am the one you've been looking for. And how mind-blowing that must have been for her. This just isn't any strange Jewish man sitting at a watering hole. This is Messiah. And he has responded this whole time with grace, when he would have every right off the bat to call her out on it and say, listen here, and set her straight, you know. But instead he has interacted with her, and he's let her be almost defensive, and he's he's walked with her through that. And then in the end, he's still given himself. He's still offered himself to her. And so I think for the woman who's struggling with sexual shame, that's the image we have to have of Christ. Like, he's still offering himself to us, knowing everything that we've done, knowing everything that we are doing, knowing everything that we are struggling with. He's still offering himself to us. It's not like he takes it back once he finds out, like he already knows.
My image, as you say that, is of Jesus on the cross with his arms open wide, and his arms are still open wide to each of us today. What is the firefighting mode, and how can we prevent the fire in the first place?
Right. So firefighting mode, I think, is something we can all get kind of stuck in. It's like it's kind of how we battle pornography one-on-one, and so, or 101. It's like, I'm going to put my sticky notes of verses on my computer. I am going to make my password something spiritual so that as I'm unlocking my phone to watch pornography, I'm trying to remind myself that Jesus loves me, And so we are waiting until like the world is on fire before we're trying to tap into the living water, right? Like, we're using God like a fire hose as opposed to what he's wanting to be, which is a spring of living water, which is something that flows through the land and nourishes it and gives it life. And I think so many women, myself included, can fall into the trap of, we don't necessarily like spend time with God every day, but man, if we don't throw up panic prayers when temptation comes, and that's when we're calling on God. And absolutely we can. Like, that's good. That is a good thing to do. It is a good thing to have Bible verses stuck in places, or to have accountability partners, or to say prayers when we feel tempted. But if those are the only ways that we're relying on God, and the only ways that we're involving God in our lives, and we're directing all of his power specifically at our porn problems, and not bringing him into our everyday, like, how do I deal with my emotions? How do I deal with this relationship? Like, if we're not trying to grow, and we're not tapping into that spring of living water that's available to us, then what I like to say is, when you use water to put out a fire, you're just left with a bunch of burned dead things. Like, you're not left with anything that's living. And yes, you might be putting out the fire of pornography, but freedom is not daily dousing fires of pornography. Like, it's meant to be an abundant life. And so if you're just sitting back looking over a burnt down forest going, whew, at least nothing's on fire, well, nothing's alive either. Like, so we have to kind of switch out of this mode of, God only wants me to relate to him when I'm like needing him to hurry up and put something out for me, and instead understand that God wants to be involved in our lives, and he wants to help us grow and heal, and he wants to bring new life to areas. And that's one of the things I love about grace. It's like, he didn't just rescue us. Like, that would be enough some days, like, just save me from myself, because heaven knows I'm enough trouble. But he rescues us and wants to restore us to relationship with him. So there's the putting out of the fire, but there's also a wanting to replenish the land and bring new life to it. And so encouraging women that God being the living water isn't just about being there in case of emergency for when you struggle with pornography the next time. It's about completely growing new life and like pushing pornography out of your life. Like, it's about change and growth and being a new creation in Christ. And as we stay connected to God, we experience that.
We're going to talk about that a little bit more after this break. Friends, we're going to take a real short break, but then stick with us, because I've got a couple more questions to ask Jessica, specifically about how Christian women can overcome the porn addiction and their sexual shame. We'll be right back. Welcome back to your Hope-Filled Perspective. Jessica, I liked how before the break you were talking about not just trying to put out the fire, but to avoid that fire in the first place. What suggestion do you have that someone could begin to implement today to start making a change in their own life if they want to overcome a porn addiction and sexual shame? Where do they begin?
Yeah, the first thing I always tell women, and they all, or most of them don't like it, but the first thing I always tell is you have to tell somebody. And that's because of that idea that shame wants us to isolate and to hide. And as long as we are living in hiding and in fear, we're not going to experience the freedom that Christ has for us. We might be able to will ourselves into some sort of freedom, but we're not going to experience what God wants for us. And so it's not about shame. Like, it's not about when you confess a struggle with pornography, it's not about coming in for your lashes kind of. It's not about that. It's not about getting removed from ministry or wherever you are. Like, you don't owe it necessarily to anybody else to confess and to share. What you're doing is you are directly confronting shame in your life. And I cannot tell you the number of women who have come to me and said, I finally decided to tell a good friend of mine, and turns out she struggles too, and fear will always make things so much bigger. I tell people fear amplifies the improbable. So the things that are not likely to happen, fear will just blow those up so that they are so big. Like, if I tell my friend she's going to disown me, she's going to tell the entire college campus, we spiral it all out of control. Are there some situations where it might not be safe? Maybe you don't have a safe family to share in, possibly. And in that case, I tell women, like, pray for God to show you one of your friends who is safe, and then be honest with them. And you're not doing it because you're expecting them to save you. You're not doing it because you expect them to be available to you 24/7 when you are tempted and need to call somebody. That's what God's for. You are doing it because you are starting to tear down that wall that shame is building around your life. And one of the first things that it does is it chains you to silence. So one of the first things I did in freedom, to find freedom, was to share that this was part of my story. And it was absolutely terrifying. Like, I did it and I felt horrible afterwards, because I told someone via a slip of paper. I just wrote on a slip of paper and handed it to them. And that weight to figure out how they responded was excruciating. And I thought I had just made the biggest mistake of my life in telling somebody. And instead, she came to me and she said, Jessica, what you wrote down on that paper was brave, and we're going to help you. And it was like, in that moment, you could almost feel the chains fall off, because I was like, I've been so afraid of telling somebody for years, because I was so afraid of what was going to happen. And now I've just told somebody and the worst has not happened. And it's like, what else has shame lied to me about? What else is on the other side of this that I've been told I can't have by shame? And so I would definitely tell women to tell somebody, and then to work through in your own personal life, like, figure out what your triggers are. What is it that's driving you to pornography? There's something. And if you want to stop doing it, one of the best ways is not to wait until you're like teetering on the edge of the website and then trying to stop yourself. One of the best ways is figuring out what is triggering you to go there and work on that. And I know it's so counterintuitive for some people, because we just want to stop. I just want to stop watching pornography. And like, how do you get me to stop? And the answer is you start to heal. And so you have to figure out where your triggers are and what is driving you there, and bring God into that part of your life too, and start healing from there. And it takes time. I want women to understand that. And I think just in the Christian community, we just have this image of like, I come to know Jesus and boom, the next day I'm not doing anything bad anymore. But pornography rewires your brain, it rewires your body, and that takes time. It's not impossible, but it takes time to work through. And if you're not working through the triggers that are like flinging you towards pornography, then you're going to have an even harder time. So even though it seems counterintuitive to not be like, destroy your iPhone and throw your computer in the trash and put up this blocker and do this, that, and the other thing, because God's more concerned with, I think God's more concerned with our healing and wanting to heal those areas of our lives that we're medicating kind of with pornography, and wanting to, when we heal those, we find ourselves desiring pornography less.
And we will make sure also that in the show notes that we put all the information about Jessica's ministry and about her book, and where you can find her on the show notes at drmichelleb.com. Jessica, as we get close to closing out this episode, I know that we have listeners who are resonating with this conversation because it is a prevalent issue. Even if the church is not talking about it, it doesn't mean it's not there. So for the listener who's resonating and feels like you've read their mail today, and maybe they've not told anyone, what hope-filled perspective do you want to leave them with today?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I could say is that fear amplifies the improbable, but faith gives life to the impossible. And so whatever you feel like is impossible, that shame's telling you is not going to happen, for single Christian women, that's often marriage. Like, you're never going to get married because no one's ever going to love you. You're going to, like, you'd be a horrible wife. No man would ever want you. Those sorts of lies that we can believe that are empowered by shame and the culture sometimes around us. Whatever it is that you think, I would love that, but that's not possible for me because of this struggle. I want you to know that it is possible. So I stand here as a Christian woman who's now married. I got married when I was 32, and I'm a mom, and I can tell you that there's a power in grace to restore, and that he wants to give us that abundant life. It is not about a bunch of burned dead things. It's not about, congratulations, you don't struggle with pornography anymore, and now I'm going to leave you to your own devices, and you're going to constantly walk around with this label. You don't have to wear the label, right? You don't have to. That's not your identity. Like, my identity is not a former porn addict. Like, you don't have to bear that identity. And so I would just want to encourage women that it looks hard at the beginning, and it looks absolutely impossible at the beginning. It's like, I'm never going to be able to live life without images popping up in my head. I'm never going to be able to be free of this desire and this compulsion. I'm never going to be able to use a computer safely. I'm never going to be able to be on my phone. And it just feels like never. And I want you to know, as someone who's standing on the other side of that, that it absolutely is possible to know freedom and an abundant life that is not touched by the effects of pornography. Like, I don't have blockers on my computer now. I've been free from pornography for years. And so it can happen. It just takes time, and don't lose faith in that process, and believe that God's desire for you is for you to have that abundant life and freedom that looks the same as the freedom that everyone else gets to have. Like, yours isn't like a special watered down version of freedom. We all get to have that freedom. So whatever your freedom looks like, if it looks like I would be married and I would have kids and I would have a thriving ministry, like, if that's what it looks like for you, that is possible as you submit to God and let him come in and heal those areas of your life and let him lead you in that freedom. You can have that, and don't let shame tell you otherwise.
Shame is a liar.
Mm-hmm.
Hear what Jessica is saying. Shame is a liar. Submit to God and let him come in and heal those areas that are at the root of the issue. Jessica, thank you so much for being a voice to so many who need to know there is help, hope, and healing when it comes to porn addiction and sexual shame. I know that you probably would never in a million years have asked for this ministry, but I am grateful to you for your obedience and for you allowing God to use your pain to encourage others. Friends, I am sure that something in this episode has encouraged your heart today. And I want you to connect with Jessica and all of her resources that we will make available to you in the show notes at drmichelleb.com. We've talked today about how prevalent the issue of porn addiction and sexual shame is for Christian women. Would you consider sharing this episode with some of your friends? You don't have to ask if this has been an issue that they struggle with, but even if they don't struggle, they know someone who does. We all know someone who does. So would you give them this dose of hope and encouragement by sharing this with them? And while you're at it, would you consider subscribing to the podcast so you don't miss a single hope-filled perspective? Friends, I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson. This has been another episode of Your Hope-Filled Perspective. Until we meet again next week, may you have a hope-filled week.